affordable 6-core CPUs have become the staple of modern gaming PCs, and for that we have AMD to thank. We also have them to blame for the fact that we even need them, even in games that really shouldn't be all that demanding. Every PS5 and Xbox Series console has an 8-core Zen 2 CPU on board, so the old high-clocked quad-core meta just doesn't cut it anymore. The last 6 years have seen 6-core Ryzens go from competing with Intel on value to beating them on performance. But just how much have they improved? This video was sponsored by AliExpress. They kindly provided the Ryzen 5 9600X and the 5500X 3D for this comparison, and you can pick up these or many other CPUs, coolers, motherboards and more in the AliExpress summer sale. There are discounts of up to 80%, and you can use one of my discount codes to get an even better price on the 6-core Ryzen of your choice, or any other item on the site. Also, if you use the QR code on screen, you can sign up to the Iceberg tech team and earn cash back while you shop to use against your next purchase. This 6-core roundup features 5 models from across 4 generations of Zen architecture, starting with the Ryzen 5 3600. Released in 2019, the Zen 2-based 3000 series marked the first time in years that AMD were approaching performance parity with then industry leaders Intel. It marked an increase in clock speeds and level 3 cache over the previous generation 2000 series, a shrink in process node from 12nm to 7, and improved DDR4 RAM compatibility. Plus, it was a simple drop-in upgrade for existing owners of the then 2-year-old AM4 platform. After the leap forward of the 3000 series, the 5000 series felt, at least on paper, more like a subtle refinement. The process node was the same, the cache size was the same, there was barely any increase in clock speeds, and you couldn't really push the RAM any further than on the previous generation. Nevertheless, the Zen 3 architecture proved to be enough of an improvement over Zen 2 that CPUs like this Ryzen 5 5600 are still popular with budget builders even now. In 2022, AMD released the first CPUs on their AM5 socket, switching from pin grid array to land grid array, gaining PCIe Gen 5 support, and changing RAM compatibility from DDR4 to DDR5. To everyone's dismay. The Zen 4-based 7000 series had a node shrink to 5nm, which enabled clock speeds over 5 GHz, an area in which AMD had previously been lagging behind Intel. The Ryzen 5 7500F I'm using for this test is the chip I've been using in my budget GPU test rig, and was essentially a 7600 with a 100 MHz lower clock speed, and omitted the newly introduced integrated graphics. These were followed in 2024 by the 9000 series, and like the 5000 series, Zen 5 specifications didn't look like a big increase over Zen 4. Another node shrink, this time from 5nm to 4, and a small bump in clock speeds were the only improvements being touted by AMD, and I don't think many people so far have been convinced. Still, this is the first time I've got hold of one myself, so I'm interested to see how it holds up. Not just to the 7500F, which is one of my personal favourite CPUs, but also to the final contender. While the 5000 series marked the end of the AM4 socket, and it has now supposedly been superseded, AM4's popularity continues to this day, thanks in no small part to the vastly higher prices of DDR5, which serves to make even cheaper AM5 CPUs look like bad value. The 5500X 3D released just last year in 2025 and features one of the innovations introduced in the 5000 series that allows it to compete with later generation CPUs. 3D V-cache, cramming in 96MB of L3 cache as opposed to the 32MB of other basic models. The 5500X 3D has lower clocks than the non-3D 5600, which gives the cheaper chip an edge in productivity, but in games, the X3D is a worthwhile investment. Now, this is a roundup of 5 very similarly spec'd CPUs, but it doesn't represent every 6-core that was released in that period. For example, the Ryzen 5 4500, 4600G and the vanilla 5500, and the 8400F and 8600G on AM5 will not feature in this video. These are usually cut back in some way, with smaller L3 caches and reduced PCIe bandwidth, and this is reflected in their value propositions. The 4500 and 8400F are among the cheapest CPUs for their respective sockets, and the G models cost more but feature surprisingly potent integrated graphics. They may get their own video at some point, but I've also reviewed the 4500 and 8400F in the past, and you can find those videos elsewhere on the channel. Starting with Cyberpunk 2077, all 5 chips were tested with high crowd density to really stress them. With path tracing enabled, the spread between the oldest and newest chips is around 55%, with the 3600 falling a few frames short of the 60 mark on average, while the 9600X passes 80 FPS with PBO enabled. You can technically get around 30% more frames on any CPU by dropping the aforementioned crowd density to low. So, if for some reason you have a 3600 paired with a GPU capable of 60 FPS path tracing, then that option is open to you. Without any RT enabled, the margin between the best and worst hasn't changed all that much, but the 3600 now scrapes over 60 FPS, whereas the 9600X can pass 90. The gap is pretty similar in Resident Evil Requiem. The path trace result shows the 9600X running over 50% faster than the 3600, though the difference is a little less earth-shattering this time around. The oldest of the featured chips is still capable of a decent 50 plus most of the time, averaging around 70 to 75 FPS. Not for the last time in this video, the 5500X 3D is really showing its worth, beating out everything but the 9600X by a small but measurable margin, with a small hit to percentile lows compared to the AM5 chips. Turning off path tracing allows practically high refresh rates across the board. Even the 3600 can surpass 100 FPS with enough GPU horsepower to back it up, whereas the AM5 chips are capable of delivering enough frames for a 144Hz monitor. In a AAA game, no less. What's most impressive is the 5500X 3D, actually surpassing the AM5 chips on average, and only being matched by the 9600X with PBO. The top half of the chart gets pretty crowded in Crimson Desert. The first few seconds of the benchmark run are nearly GPU limited on the 9600X, 7500F and 5500X 3D, so the difference doesn't really start to appear until the number of NPCs increase around the centre of Hernand. That also means the difference between the oldest and newest is slightly truncated in this title, with the 9600X only 45% ahead of the 3600. I guess next time around I'll have to go to DLSS Ultra Performance, which at 1440p means internal rendering at just 480p. The Last of Us Part 2 is one of those games that's unreasonably heavy on the CPU. I say this in every CPU review I ever do, mainly because I don't like to assume that everyone watches all of my videos, but I should probably point out that while this is a true statement, as can be seen in the Afterburner overlay, it also doesn't mean that you need a modern X3D beast of a chip to get playable frame rates. Yes, the 9600X is a whopping 66% faster than the old 3600 in this benchmark, but in raw numbers, that's comparing an insane 150 FPS average to a still extremely playable 90 plus on the 3600. Death Stranding 2 doesn't seem to take too well to PBO overclocking. The 7500F was within the margin of error when comparing PBO on versus PBO off, but both the 5600 and 9600X showed negative scaling. Weird. Anyway, the best 9600X result was just 42% beyond the 3600 here, and it didn't particularly look like a GPU bottleneck. In Hitman World of Assassination, with best simulation quality enabled, none of the CPUs really seems up to the task of a smooth benchmark run. Once the physics kick in, almost every single chip drops below 60 FPS, and the 9600X only passes that particular bar with PBO turned on. This isn't really a buying guide per se, but if you're looking for the best possible Hitman experience, you should be looking for something with at least 8 cores. At base simulation, the compute workload is severely reduced, so we're just straight up seeing how quickly the CPU can handle frames from the GPU. Now there's a 70% delta between the oldest and newest chips, though even the 3600 is surpassing 100 FPS on average, and percentile lows past the all-important 60 mark on the 5600 and above. With path tracing turned on, Doom the Dark Ages is completely bottlenecked by the RTX 5090 at around 137 FPS. I should probably have tested this one with DLSS Ultra Performance, 1080p output resolution, or both. You live and learn. Anyway, onto the non-PT performance, and the biggest difference we've seen yet, with the 9600X leading the 3600 by a whopping 73% on average. Everything from the 5500X 3D upwards is capable of more than enough for a 144Hz monitor, and again it's worth mentioning that the X3D chip just about pips the 7500F to second place. One game that seems to thrive on newer architectures is Baldur's Gate 3. Despite only requiring a modest GPU to run at ultra quality settings, the city of Baldur's Gate itself can be punishing on the processor, and the 3600 is only capable of a little over 70 FPS on average, with lows dropping into the 40s. Meanwhile, the 9600X is a whopping 78% faster, passing 120 FPS with or without PBO. Not bad for a turn-based RPG, but also not needed for a turn-based RPG. Still, it's a good benchmark and really shows what the CPUs are capable of. As per usual, online games aren't controlled environments, so take these numbers with a huge pinch of salt, but the benchmark results in Arc Raiders are quite instructive as to how far the Zen architecture has come in just 6 years. The game is a fairly smooth runner as far as UE5 games go, and even the oldest chip is delivering a better frame rate than a basic TV or monitor can really display, but the 9600X is over 90% improved, averaging 181 FPS with PBO and 160 without. This is also a rare miss for the 5500X 3D, where it comes in third place behind the 7500F. Finally, Battlefield 6 is a similar story to Arc Raiders, though even on this large conquest map, the 3600 is capable of a 100 FPS average. The 9600X meanwhile is approaching 180 without PBO and almost 200 with it turned on. The 7500F is holding up well, though once again it needs PBO to surpass the X3D chip. There's a few ways to look at these results. From a purely stats-based perspective, it's pretty incredible to see how far CPUs have come in a relatively short time. Think back to 2017 and how far the needle moved from the i7 2600K to the 7700K, or rather how far it hadn't moved. To some degree, these benchmarks exposed the lie of the 6-core meta. Yes, the average performance looks great across the board, even on the older chips, and that is the most important thing. However, percentile lows are still a very relevant factor, and some gamers are more sensitive to stutter than others. In that regard, the 9600X is at the top of the tree, as you might expect. It's not a huge jump over the 7500F overall, and if we're being completely honest, it's debatable whether it's worth the substantial price premium. But it can deliver 60 plus minimums in titles where the older chips can't. On the other hand, a more pertinent way of looking at these results in the current climate is less in terms of raw performance and more in terms of value for money. The 7500F is very inexpensive for what it offers, and the money you'd have to spend to step up to the 9600X could instead go towards an 8-core like the 7700, which is going to do as well as or better than even the 9600X in physics-heavy titles and when dealing with ray and path tracing. Not to mention productivity, which I've ignored in this video so far. Meanwhile, it might not have the best frame times in the world, but the average performance of the 5500X 3D is phenomenal. Certainly more than enough to support a high-end GPU like a 9070 XT or 5070 Ti, and if you're upgrading from an older AM4 chip, then you can't argue with the value. That being said, the 5500X 3D is in short supply and high demand, so I don't know for how long you'll be able to pick it up for this kind of price. I used to recommend the 5700X 3D back when it was around 100 quid. Now look what's happened. My message for the first few months of 2026, which was a pretty dark time for me professionally, was to be prepared to be happy with what you've got for the foreseeable future. If that's a Ryzen 5 3600 or 5600, congratulations, you can run pretty much any modern game at 60 FPS or more, in many cases even with ray tracing enabled. You might not want to pair it with a 5090, but you shouldn't find many instances where your CPU holds you back from an enjoyable experience. So, I guess the bottom line is, buy the 9600X. Unless you'd rather buy a 7700 for the same price, or be happy with the 7500F for a lower price, or don't switch platforms and get the 5500X 3D, it's really good, or be happy with your 5600, or even the 3600 if you're really strapped for cash. Pick whichever message most suits your personal situation and pretend that was my conclusion all along. Thanks again to AliExpress for sponsoring the video. If you've been inspired to pick up a new CPU, then don't forget to use my discount codes. And if you're a regular shopper, why not join the Iceberg tech team before you buy and earn cash back off your next purchase. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.